The history of heavy. Hello and welcome to the History of Heavy podcast, episode 2. This is a show that traces the chronology of heavy music across genres, song by song. I'm your host in Venice Beach, California, Michael Huntsman, and all the way up north in San Francisco, California is my co-host, as always, Big Daddy Dave Lieberman. Hello, David.
Sorry for duty, sir.
How are you, man? It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. I'm doing really good. I'm excited about episode 2. We got our juices flowing from episode 1, and we've got a long list of songs to go through, and I'm excited about this project.
We do. We have quite a list. Currently stands at 148 songs. It is very dynamically changing. So who knows where we will get to by the end of this project. You can check out the list ahead of time. Again, it changes pretty regularly, so I can't promise it'll be the same tomorrow. But it is on Spotify as a Spotify playlist, the History of Heavy podcast. Please check it out. But I was looking at that list earlier today, Dave, and noting that we talked about Link Wray last time in 1959. Tonight we're talking about the Kingsmen in 1963. A little bit of a gap there. These first few episodes, there's 2 to 3, 4, 5 year gaps sometimes between songs. So there's a lot in the world going on to get to. Also, a lot of songs we're not necessarily talking about that could qualify. Some of this is happenstance just in terms of what we wanted to talk about. Some of this is intentional. When we get to 1968, for example, we have probably a half a dozen songs that we will talk about to represent that year. But not exactly so in these first few episodes. So there will be some significant context to provide about what was going on in the intervening years between songs, between episodes. And that portion of the podcast is always covered by Dave in the Cultural Corner. So Dave, tell us exactly what was going on in 1963. Dave's Cultural!
Well, hold on to your hat, because 1963 was a tumultuous year. A lot of very important things were happening. Probably top of the stack would be the assassination of President JFK and the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald. That left a lasting impression on the collective memory that echoes through the present day. Travel, financial, and commercial transactions by the United States to Cuba are made illegal. The publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique launches the reawakening of the women's movement in the United States. The civil rights movement is kind of on fire with the March on Washington, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and it's the assassination of civil rights activist Medgar Evers. That's all in 1963. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay closes. Zip codes are introduced in the United States. In other media, the Beatles released their first album, Please Please Me, and Bob Dylan released the song Blowin' in the Wind. The Trashmen released Surfin' Bird is the Word, and I want to talk about this a little bit because this is not on our list, but the recording of this dude on TV is nuts, and it should be looked up and enjoyed.
I'll put a link for it below.
Yeah, the 1963 record of the year was Days of Wine and Roses by Henry Mancini. Popular movies at this time: The Birds, The Pink Panther, Dr. No, the first James Bond movie, was released in the U.S. in 1963. The Oscar for Best Picture that year was Lawrence of Arabia. In other news, The first touch-tone telephone was introduced by AT&T. The lava lamp was first sold. Cassette tapes were used to record and play audio in Europe and introduced in the US the following year. Elsewhere, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa is exhibited in the United States for the only time, being unveiled at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The comic book Iron Man debuts in Tales of Suspense, number 39. Coca-Cola Company debuts its first diet drink, Tab Cola. And for my friend in Venice Beach, the Los Angeles Dodgers defeat the New York Yankees 4-0 to win their third World Series title in baseball.
Let's go, baby.
So, a lot going on of significance in 1963 that is the backdrop for our song today.
Yeah, look, wow. A lot really great culturally and from an entertainment perspective, a lot really bad from a kind of world and political perspective. Hard to capture in a single song, but we are capturing 1963 in a single song. This is the only song we will talk about on this podcast from that year, but this song is a doozy. I have a lot to say about this song, just like you had a lot to say about this year. So let's get through it a little bit and calibrate exactly the Kingsmen and Louie Louie, which didn't start with the Kingsmen. It started in 1958 right here in Los Angeles, California, where it was written by a songwriter named Richard Berry. And it was released as a single by Richard Berry and the Pharaohs in 1957. Berry admitted that he lifted the song's main riff directly from Rene Touzette's version of an R&B song called El Loco Cha-Cha. Berry wrote the lyrics from his personal perspective, talking to his local bartender, who was in fact named Louie. The significance of Louie Louie in broader rock and roll terms and in the rock and roll canon cannot be overstated. The song has been recognized by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Grammys, Rolling Stone magazine, and the National Endowment for the Arts, to name just a few. There has been a book written about the song called Louie Louie, The History and Mythology of the World's Most Famous Rock and Roll Song. That song written by Dave Marsh. It has been identified as the world's most covered song, with somewhere around 2,000 different versions having been recorded, including versions by Paul Revere and the Raiders, the Beach Boys, Otis Redding, the Kinks, Frank Zappa, the Ventures, Pink Floyd, Motörhead, Iggy Pop, and of course, Black Flag. The most famous version of the song, and the version that most of those artists were covering, was actually a cover itself, and that is the version by the Kingsmen, which was released in 1963, and that is, of course, the version we will be talking about tonight. They recorded the song on April 6th, 1963, in their hometown of Portland, Oregon, after having rehearsed the song the night before at a local teen club where they played a 90-minute version of the tune. So they were kind of sun before sun, or earth before earth. The song was released as a single in June of 1963, and the ragged, sloppy, and kind of chaotic nature helped kick off the emerging garage rock scene in the U.S. Adding to that shambolic nature of the song, a significant error in the Kingsmen version occurs just after the guitar solo, when lead vocalist Jack Ely misses his mark and comes in two bars too soon before the reinstatement of the riff. He realized his mistake and stops the verse short, but the band didn't realize that he had done so. So as a quick fix, the drummer, a guy named Lynn Easton, covered the pause with a drum fill. The error kind of imbued their recording with a touch of humility and humanity, and now is so well known that that mistake is actually included in many of the cover versions that I earlier mentioned. The song was originally pretty slow to chart until Boston DJ Arnie Ginsberg played it as the worst record of the week on his drive time show. By December of that year, it was in the Billboard Top 100, peaking at number 2, and would remain on the charts through February of the following year. As it climbed the national charts, the song's kind of infamously incomprehensible vocals gave rise to rumors that the song had dirty lyrics. and many news networks began filing reports from cities across America, nearly hysterical over the possible dangers of the record. So it was kind of satanic panic before satanic panic. The song quickly became something of a Rorschach test for dirty minds who thought they could detect obscene suggestions in the lyrics. For decades, the song's right holders would not allow the lyrics to be published because they wanted people to continue to fantasize what the actual words were, which I think is so cool.
Right.
As
brilliant
if that,
marketing, by the way.
say that again.
Brilliant marketing move.
Oh, so smart. Yeah, so smart. So the legacy of the song, as if all of that wasn't enough, just a few more things about that legacy. The Kinks and the Who, pretty significant rock and roll bands who we will be talking about on this podcast, both cited Louie Louie as a significant song in the development of their sounds in the mid 60s. Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth credits Louie Louie for igniting his passion for music and called the song a totem of magic, which I loved. As mentioned, both Motörhead and Black Flag famously covered the song, which is actually why, if I'm being honest, that the song is included on our list to begin with. And it has been featured in a million movies, notably American Graffiti, Animal House, Quadrophenia, Wayne's World 2, and Old School. And all of that is fine and dandy, but Dave, is Louie Louie heavy?
Glad that you gave that context that you just gave, because pursuant to our last conversation about Link Wray's Rumble and how it was slow and sludgy, this has a much more upbeat tempo, but this has some attitude. This is all kind of fast and loose, and what we're gonna do. We're doing this right now. This is for us. This has attitude. It's sloppy in its way, unapologetically, and that's what makes it so, one of the things that make it so endearing. But the fact that it is the choice of bands like Motörhead and the Kinks and Black Flag allows this to rise to the bar of heavy in our conversation. All by itself, an argument can be made that it isn't. Because of its legacy, it definitely is.
I think that's right. And, you know, something we talked about in episode 1 is that sonic heaviness is certainly important to the songs we will be talking about on this podcast, but there are other things. It's not exclusive. And there is a heaviness. And I think the controversy about the lyrics, the mistake in the vocals that is kept in, the riff itself, although, again, a little tinny in the Kingsmen recording, certainly sounds like of the day. It sounds like, you know, a 60s garage rock song. But that riff, dun 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 dun, is pretty heavy, you know.
It's heavy and it's power chords.
And it's power chords. You know, thank you, Link Wray. Yeah, it's there is something very also. There is something very, I don't know, naughty is such a light word.
How about defiant?
Defiant's a good one. Defiant's a good one. Yeah.
That's
yeah. Right. You know, going back to the origins of Richard Berry writing the song about, you know, effectively having a conversation with his local bartender and that he's got to go. Sort of by the time it gets to the Kingsmen, is sort of perceived to be about a customer talking to a prostitute, or a sailor talking to a prostitute. You know, the interpretations vary, but I think that heaviness, I like the sailor piece in particular because there's sort of something pirate flaggy about Louie Louie. There's something outlaw-ish to Louie Louie that I can't and have never been exactly able to define. Even when you listen to specifically Motörhead's version, and it's Motörhead playing that song, but even Motörhead's version isn't necessarily sonically that heavy. But because it's Lemmy and because it's Motörhead and because it was the Kinks and it was the Who and you know, it wasn't the it wasn't the Monkees or even the Beatles or those kinds of bands doing Louie Louie. It was sort of the fringy, outsider bands that were playing it.
The bands that you just mentioned, they all land in our heavy list. There's a connection here that they made. They made the connection, and it makes sense for us to make that connection as well. I think that it does meet the bar of heavy because of its legacy, because of what emotion it evokes in the listener.
Well, yeah. Look, we talked about Motörhead, Black Flag, Kinks, The Who, Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth. Those 5 bands right there are incredibly important to the legacy of heavy music. And do Motörhead, Black Flag, Sonic Youth, the Kinks, The Who sound like they sound without Louie Louie? I don't know, maybe not. So I think this is a really good example of a song that is the legacy it wrought is as important to its heaviness or its heaviness credentials as how the song sonically sounds in 2024 or in 1963 coming out of your speakers.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah. The other thing about Louie Louie that you brought up on the Rumble episode that maybe was certainly more so than Rumble, but that a lot of these songs have in common is not super danceable. Not right. Exactly clear how you dance this song. And I think danceability begins to become a dividing line. If that's the fence. If being able to dance is the fence, on one side there's heavy songs, and on the other side there's not heavy songs.
So I'm going to use that as a segue to talk a little bit about the bird is the word, because
talk about Surfin Bird.
Surfin Bird, excuse me, yeah. When I was researching Louie Louie, that just popped up in another playlist, and you're going to link the TV appearance of this guy, and he goes nuts. And this is like a very interesting, again, this is also 1963, and it's not in our heavy conversation, but it's sort of heavy adjacent because of its attitude, because of its non-conformist. It just does not fit into whatever music is going on. It's definitely not danceable. This dude is flapping his arms and walking around doing the duck walk around, and it's like almost looks like he's having a seizure. It's bizarre. It's something to witness. But this is, again, this is the earliest part of the spectrum for us, and why we're skipping around in these early years a little bit. We did Link Ray 58, we didn't do 59, 60, 61, 62. We could probably find something there, but the higher points are Link Ray and Louie Louie. And while there's other stuff happening, these are the ones we're talking about. So I did want to give just honorable mention to Surfin' Bird, but it isn't really heavy in the sonic way. It's more heavy in the legacy and the attitude and the kind of permission that it gives the rest of those bands who did cover Louie Louie to even exist.
Well said. Our podcast is just developing. This is episode 2. We might have a sister song segment emerging. So last week when talking about Link Ray, you mentioned Dick Dale's cover of Miserlou, and we talked about how Miserlou is kind of the punk rock kind of side of the fence, and Rumble. I would argue the same thing here. The most famous version, the reason I know Surfing Bird is because of the Ramones version on Rocket to Russia. So, I first heard Miserlou because Agent Orange did it in 1982. So I would argue that Surfing Bird is the punk rock, has the punk rock legacy behind it, while Louie Louie, again, has kind of the metal kind of legacy attached to it.
You would argue that, and you would win that argument.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, so how do you feel about Louie Louie today? We talked last week about these songs that are just kind of part of the fabric of our music lives. Certainly Rumble is one of the, I almost called it Rumble. Louie Louie is that too. Does Louie Louie have any, I don't know, any significance to you today other than, doing a podcast episode about it?
One I have more of a personal relationship with, but it's so old I don't remember what the exact catalyst was. I just remember hearing it for the first time awakened something in me that wasn't there before. It was dormant. It was there. It was just dormant. I didn't know it was there before. And it was when you have this moment of personal awakening, when something inside you emerges, you have this kind of paradoxical realization. This was always there, but I didn't know about it, and now I do. And what do I do with that? And it took that's just a relationship I remember having, hearing this for the first time. So when I hear this song, I have a personal affection for it. You asked me if I love the Link Ray song, and I said Link Ray is more of, or Rumble is more of a good old friend. Louie Louie, I love.
Okay. When we talked about Rumble, you said, the first time you heard it was on the Pulp Fiction soundtrack, and I can't remember. It's hard for me to imagine that was the first time I'd heard that song, but it's quite possible that it was. Louie Louie, the same thing. And the reason Rumble and Louie Louie, I can't place when I first heard them, because they both feels like songs that have always been with me. They just feel, the song I most associate with Louie Louie is Wild Thing by the Trogs. Not talked about on this podcast, but covered very famously and well by X in the early 80s, the punk band X, one of my favorite all-time bands. But those songs, Wild Thing, Louie Louie, Rumble, unlike most, I'm going to say that these are the only two songs in the currently 148 songs that we'll be talking about on this podcast that I can't necessarily identify when I first heard them. The rest of them, I pretty much know right around when I first heard them, if not exactly when I first heard them. Rumble and Louie Louie, again, just feel like they've always been with me. And, I grew up with sisters who are much older than I am. They would have been young kids when Louie Louie came out, but 5 years before I was born. So they were always playing music in the house, and that's where I first came to know a lot of the music that I love, but a lot of that kind of 60s and early 70s rock and pop music. It's possible that I doubt Rumble, but Louie Louie certainly might have been played by my sisters in the house. But it's sort of like Sinatra or Beethoven or these certain artists, James Brown, that just seem like they've always been with me, although there weren't. There was a time when I heard Louie Louie for the first time, which seems crazy. It's like it's such a it's just there. It's like a tattoo on my brain.
Right. It's a fundamental. It's a foundation.
Fundamental's a good word. Fundamental's a good word. Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to point out is you mentioned that when they first played this, they played it for 90 minutes. And I do remember that when I first heard this, I listened to it 2 or 3 more times in a row. It ended too abruptly. I wanted it to keep going, so I just went back for more.
I love the fact that they played a 90-minute version of it the night before, and still when they got in the studio, they fucked it up.
Yes.
I think that's so cool. Yeah, and for all those 2,000 some odd cover versions of them, I'm sure I have, but outside of the Kingsmen, Motörhead, and Black Flag, I can't identify a single other version of the song that I've ever heard. I don't know that I've ever heard the original. Isn't that weird?
Originally written.
Richard Berry's, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember hearing it many years ago. I looked it up. somehow listen to it because I wanted to get the story behind the lyrics that are printed, which is about a ship and going out to sea and the memory of a girl and everything. And it's much more clear in that earlier version. You can hear the lyrics, but it didn't grab me. It was not the same. It's the performance that the Kingsmen provide that gives it that heavy oomph. It gives it an unctuous quality to it. I don't know how to describe it.
Last episode you talked about the birth of the teenager and 50s culture and that emergence and the attitude and all of the stuff that came with that. That's certainly apparent in the Kingsmen version of Louie Louie that wouldn't have existed prior, right? So that sort of attitude and angst that we're always talking about kind of begins with the Kingsmen, which is why I think that's the version that everybody else later, would cover.
Yeah, and that birth of the garage rock, there's a screaming quality to the lyrics at a couple of points in the song where, all right, it just pulls you in.
Well, it's you talked about do-it-yourself culture when we talked about custom car builders last time. That DIY thing is really Louie feels handmade, and that's important. And I think it's interesting in 2 episodes. In episode 4, we'll talk about "The Witch" by the Sonics, one of my all-time favorite songs, which is to me kind of Mount Rushmore garage rock. And interesting that I find a heaviness in garage rock that I don't necessarily find in punk rock, which is clearly a disciple of garage rock. So I would argue that garage rock has more in common with punk than it does with metal, but there's something, and certainly when you get to the MC5 and the Stooges and those kinds of bands that certainly emerge from a garage rock scene, there's a heaviness to them clearly that Detroit and drug, a lot going on there, but it's interesting that I find garage rock heavy, even like Mudhoney heavy, but punk rock less so. Any take on that? It's fuzzier. Maybe that's why.
I think that I would look at it like I would put it into an analogy into like a religion context where garage rock is the clergy and one denomination is punk rock and one denomination is metal. I was listening, the garage bands that I was seeing in garages were Great Edge hardcore in Southern California. Shout out to Chula Vista Hardcore. And that was slow and heavy. That stuff was heavy.
But that's not garage rock. That's not garage rock because
I know that's not garage rock.
Right.
But that's what garage rock accommodates. And so that's like garage rock is a neutrality. It's a format, but it's not a form. It can take on different form. What's a better analogy?
Well, wait though, because the way I'm using the term garage rock is as a genre.
Okay.
So I'm calling the Sonics, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about this because we're going to talk about it in 2 episodes. But the Kingsmen, I think, certainly helped usher in this sound, and that is really fuzzy guitars, a whole lot of attitude, real significant sloppiness. I mean, Nirvana is kind of a direct descendant of garage rock, and so is a lot of that Seattle stuff. It's the Sonics are from Seattle, so there's some, the Kinks have a lot of kind of garage rock in them, but I don't think of the Ramones as a garage rock band. The Ramones are a punk rock band. Like there is a difference. It's the speediness of the riffs, it's the tone.
Maybe the difference is the authentic rawness that makes
Raw's a good
garage
word.
rock. Just the unrefined, unfiltered raw, and that can result in a punk rockier flavor or a metalier flavor, a heavier flavor. But it's garage rock has a raw quality that's just honest and unpolished and unapologetic. Is that a good way to put it?
No, I agree with everything you just said, but I would also attribute everything you just said to punk rock, which is again my confusion. And I guess it's sort of like pornography, right? You know it when you hear it.
Well, I'm glad that we've touched on this moment of confusion, because this will be a continued thread. I would love to retouch on this thread as we go through, and let's evolve a response and a viewpoint on this exact topic. How does garage rock fit in, and how does a song fit into garage rock?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. And look, we're gonna hit on all kinds of genre, from garage to metal to some punk to funk to jazz to drone to stoner to everything in between. But I think the genre distinction, although we are genre agnostic on this show, I think talking about genre is interesting and fun. So we should definitely include that in our conversations. Anything else you want to say about Louie Louie of the Kingsmen tonight?
It's a fun song. I love this song. I have a great relationship with this song. It opens doors for bands and for music later, but it opened up something inside me. So I got a lot of love for this song. I'm glad this is on our list and early in our conversation.
This is off the cuff. I didn't prep you for this, and if you don't like this idea, we can can it. But maybe an interesting thing to do as we were just beginning this journey, but as we near Mount Doom, this might become a very interesting thing well down the line. But I thought it might be interesting if we each pick a song. We pit songs against each other until we ultimately have our favorite heaviest song at the very end. We would each have a different one, presumably. So the way this would work is tonight I would say, Dave, keep one, lose one. You can only have either Rumble or Louie Louie for the rest of your life. Which one do you take? Which you could do today in episode 2, probably relatively easily. But the way it would work is then you would take Louie Louie as your champion into next week and pit it against next week's song. And then you could only take one song every week going forward. If you don't like this idea, we can edit it out.
I'm going to quash that because we have 100 and how many songs?
148 songs, Dave.
Okay, and this is already challenging enough to do this exercise on some of my favorite Black Sabbath albums. So, and there's only 8, 10, 11 songs on those. So I'm going to ask for grace on this and suggest that we have a more anecdotal conversation about how heavy it is compared to maybe the last one that we did. But there's no way I can commit to a gladiator style bracket final four.
Anybody listening to this, you heard that idea. It's a good one. I know you listeners agree. We won't do it. For the sake of argument, tonight I would have taken Rumble. I think Dave would have taken Louie Louie. So we'll just leave it at that. Next week we'll be.
You know what? I'll follow you down this rabbit hole for the first 10. I'll see you at 10.
Let's see how it starts. Okay.
Okay. I'm Louie Louie.
I'm taking Rumble next week. Dave is taking Louie Louie into battle next week. And those songs will be battling the Kinks' You Really Got Me, which will be an interesting conversation based on the conversation we just had about garage rock, punk, and metal, because that song certainly influenced both punk and metal. So, and is certainly heavy. So we will get into that next week. That will be episode 3, the Kinks. But this was episode 2, Louie Louie. That was fun, man. Good time. We did it.
A lot of fun. Great conversation. I'm loving this project.
Yeah, man. Thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you next time.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.